My husband died 5 years ago and left me nothing but debts. But a month later, a banker called me. Your husband opened an account in 1978 and kept adding to it for 40 years while he was alive. When they told me the balance that belonged to me, I couldn't believe it. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew my husband. 41 years of marriage will do that to you. 41 years of coffee at the same kitchen table, of arguing over the thermostat in winter, of watching him fall asleep in front of the evening news before 10 o'clock. You start to believe you've mapped every corner of a person. You start to believe there are no rooms left you haven't entered. His name was Robert Harlow. Bob, to everyone who loved him. He was a civil engineer from Cincinnati, Ohio, a quiet man with large hands and a habit of humming old Sinatra tunes while he washed the dishes. We met in 1981 at a church potluck in Hyde Park. He brought a terrible green bean casserole, and I told him so to his face. He laughed so hard he spilled sweet tea on his collar. 3 months later, he proposed on the banks of the Ohio River, and I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't supposed to be. We raised our son, Danny, in a brick colonial on Westover Hills Boulevard. Bob worked long hours. I taught third grade for 22 years, then retired to take care of his mother when she got sick. We took vacations to Gatlinburg and Myrtle Beach. We refinanced the house twice. We fought about money the way most middle-class couples do, quietly and with great exhaustion. When Bob died of a heart attack in March of 2019, I thought the hardest part would be the loneliness. I was wrong. The hardest part was the paperwork. Within 6 weeks of his funeral, I was sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared 40 years of coffee, surrounded by statements and overdue notices I had never seen before. A second mortgage on the house I didn't know existed. A line of credit opened in 2016. Medical bills, yes, but also something vaguer. Transfers, withdrawals, accounts I couldn't trace. My name was on almost none of them. I remember my hands shaking as I sorted through the files. Danny sat across from me, his face pale, saying very little. He was 34 years old, and he looked like a boy who'd just been told Santa Claus wasn't real. The debt, when I finally added it up, came to just over $190,000. I told myself there was an explanation. Bob had been sick for 2 years before he died. The cardiac episodes, the medications, the specialist visits in Columbus. Medical debt was not unusual. Financial disorganization was not unusual. I told myself I simply hadn't paid close enough attention. But there had been signs, hadn't there? The phone calls Bob used to take in the garage. The way he'd close his laptop when I walked into the room, slowly, with the particular casualness of someone trying not to look like they were hiding something. The Christmas of 2017, when his daughter Diane drove up from Louisville with her mother Barbara, his first wife, for what she called a family check-in, which I had always found strange since Bob and Barbara had been divorced since 1979. Diane was 47 years old and worked in real estate. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had never, in 20 years of knowing me, called me anything but Margaret, despite the fact that everyone else in my life called me Peggy. It was a small thing. I used to tell myself it was a small thing. But small things have a way of adding up. After Bob's death, Diane arrived at the house before the reception was even over. She went through his study, I assumed to collect personal items. She was polite. She was efficient. She took 2 cardboard boxes and left within the hour. I didn't think to ask what was in them. That was my first mistake. The second was trusting that the estate had been settled honestly. I didn't hire my own attorney. I relied on the family's longtime lawyer, Gerald Pruitt, who had known Bob for 30 years and who explained everything to me in a tone that suggested I wouldn't understand the details anyway. I signed what he put in front of me. I took the pen and I signed. And then I spent 5 years paying down a dead man's debts, selling off what I could, living on my teacher's pension and what little Social Security covered, wondering what I had done wrong. 5 years. Until the Tuesday morning in April when my phone rang, and an unfamiliar voice said, "Mrs. Harlow, my name is Thomas Vale. I'm a senior accounts manager at First Fidelity Trust. I'm calling about an account held in your husband's name. Yours as well, as co-beneficiary. It was opened in 1978, and I believe you may not be aware it exists." I sat down on the kitchen floor. I hadn't even made it to a chair. I stayed on that kitchen floor for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the coffee I'd left on the counter to go cold. Long enough for the morning light to shift from pale gold to flat white through the kitchen curtains. I held the phone in my lap and I stared at the linoleum, and I tried to make sense of what Thomas Vale had just told me. He'd been careful on the call, measured, professional. He said he couldn't discuss account specifics over the phone. Privacy protocols, he explained, required that I come into the branch and present identification. He gave me an address on 5th Street, downtown. He said someone would be available Thursday morning at 10. He asked if that worked for me. I said yes. I said it before I had processed a single word he'd spoken. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything he'd told me, word by word, the way I used to take notes in a faculty meeting. It helped me think. It had always helped me think. Account opened in 1978. Co-beneficiary. First Fidelity Trust. Bob and I didn't meet until 1981, which meant this account, whatever it was, predated our marriage, and yet my name was on it. He had added me at some point, quietly, without ever mentioning it. Why? I turned that question over in my mind for the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday. I cleaned the house because I needed something to do with my hands. I reorganized the linen closet. I walked the 2 blocks to the park and sat on a bench near the duck pond and watched a young woman push a stroller in slow, patient circles. And I thought about all the conversations Bob and I had never had. We had talked about everything. That was what I always said at dinner parties in those early years. Bob and I talk about everything. We disagreed about politics, about child rearing, about whether it was acceptable to refrigerate tomatoes. We had argued and reconciled and argued again for 4 decades. I had believed, sincerely believed, that there was an honesty between us. But what is honesty in a marriage, really? Is it the absence of lies? Or is it something more active? The willingness to hand another person every key you own, including the ones to rooms you'd rather keep locked? I went home and made myself eat dinner. Soup from a can. I sat at the table alone, the way I had every evening for 5 years, and I thought about Diane. That was when the shape of something began to form in my mind. Diane had come to the house the day of the funeral and taken 2 boxes from Bob's study. I had never asked what was in them. I had never thought to ask. But now I thought of other things. Small details I had filed away without examining. The way she'd insisted on handling all communication with Gerald Pruitt during the estate process, acting as the point of contact to spare me the stress. The way she had summarized the estate documents for me, rather than walking me through them line by line. The way she had stood in my kitchen 2 months after the funeral and said, gently, that I should probably think about downsizing, that the house payments were going to be challenging going forward. She had known about the debt. Had she also known about the account? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed I had shared with Bob for 37 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I made a list in my head. Not of what I knew, but of what I needed to find out. Thursday morning, I was at First Fidelity Trust on 5th Street by 9:40. I sat in a chair in the lobby and waited. The branch was cool and quiet, the way banks always are, as if money prefers a certain temperature. A young woman at the front desk brought me water without my asking. Thomas Vale was exactly what his voice had suggested. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, careful in his movements. He shook my hand and led me to a glass-walled office near the back and closed the door. He told me the balance. I won't share the exact figure here, not yet, but I will tell you this. It was more than I had earned in 30 years of teaching. It was more than the debt. It was more than the house. It was, by any measure I had available to me, a life-changing sum. I kept my face very still. I had learned, in 5 years of navigating grief and financial ruin, that the moment you show someone how much something matters, you give them power over you. "I'll need documentation," I said. "Everything you have." Thomas nodded as though he had expected this. He slid a folder across the desk. On the drive home, I stopped at a Walgreens and bought a new legal pad, a box of manila folders, and a set of colored pens. Then I went home and I began to plan. The first thing I did was find a lawyer who had never heard of Gerald Pruitt. I didn't want a referral from anyone in Bob's circle. I didn't want someone who played golf with someone who once had lunch with someone who knew Diane. I wanted a stranger, someone whose only loyalty was to the facts and to me. I found her through the Ohio State Bar Association's online directory. Her name was Carol Simmons. She had 23 years of experience in estate law and elder financial abuse litigation, and her office was in Blue Ash, far enough from Hyde Park that I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew in the parking lot. Her assistant gave me an appointment for the following Monday. That weekend, I sat at the kitchen table with my new legal pad and went through everything I had: the estate documents I had signed, the account documentation from Thomas Vale, the debt records I had been living with for 5 years. I made a timeline. I cross-referenced dates. I wrote down every conversation with Diane that I could remember, noting what she had said and, more importantly, what she had specifically steered me away from asking. The pattern was not subtle once I was looking for it. Carol Simmons was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the calm, systematic energy of someone who spent her professional life sorting through other people's worst surprises. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she put on her glasses and read through the documents I had brought. "The co-beneficiary designation was added in 1989, she said, looking at the First Fidelity paperwork. "Did your husband ever mention that to you?" "Never." "And the estate was settled through Gerald Pruitt?" "Yes." "Did Pruitt have access to your husband's full financial records?" I told her I assumed so. She wrote something on her notepad and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Harlow," she said finally, "if this account existed at the time of your husband's death and was not disclosed during probate, that is a serious problem. It may constitute fraud against the estate. Depending on what we find, it could involve your husband's attorney, his daughter, or both." The word fraud sat in the air between us like a stone dropped into still water. I drove home through the April afternoon thinking about Gerald Pruitt, his measured explanations, his patient sighs, his habit of addressing me as if I were a child being told why she couldn't have dessert before dinner. Had he simply been negligent? Or had he been deliberate? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. Carol called me that Wednesday. She had submitted a formal records request to First Fidelity Trust, and Thomas Vale had been cooperative. What emerged from the documentation was this. 18 months before Bob's death, in September of 2017, someone had submitted a written inquiry to the bank asking about the process for removing a co-beneficiary from an account. The inquiry had been submitted on behalf of Robert Harlow, but the handwriting on the original letter was not Bob's. Thomas Vale had kept the original because something about it had struck him as irregular at the time, and he had never filed it away properly. It had sat in a physical folder in his desk drawer for years, which was how it had survived. He couldn't say legally what it meant, but he had made a copy for Carol. Carol sent me a scan that evening. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the handwriting on the letter, and I recognized it immediately. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on casserole dishes returned with thank you notes, on a Christmas card that said, "Wishing you a peaceful season." Margaret in large looping letters that pressed hard into the paper. It was Diane's handwriting. In September of 2017, while Bob was alive but weakening, while I was managing his medications and driving him to appointments in Columbus, his daughter had written to his bank, using his name, asking how to cut me out of an account she was not supposed to know existed. She had known about the account for at least 2 years before he died. She had tried to remove me. She had failed. The bank had required Bob to appear in person for any beneficiary changes, and Bob, whether out of reluctance or declining health, had never done so. And then he had died. And Gerald Pruitt had guided me through an estate settlement that never once mentioned First Fidelity Trust. How much had Pruitt known? How many conversations had there been between Diane and Barbara and a family attorney about what to do with the wife who had signed whatever they put in front of her? I closed my laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Carol Simmons. "I'm ready," I said. "Tell me what we do next." Carol filed the complaint on a Thursday. It was a civil action naming Diane Harlow Cross and Gerald Pruitt as respondents in a claim of fraudulent concealment of estate assets. It cited the First Fidelity Trust account, the unauthorized letter submitted in Bob's name, and Pruitt's failure to disclose the account during probate proceedings. Carol had also filed a separate complaint with the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct regarding Pruitt's conduct as an attorney. She told me it would take time. These things always took time. But the filing itself was a declaration. It put names on paper in an official record where they could not be quietly undone. I felt when she told me it was done something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter. A sense of having finally stood in the correct place. I went to Grater's Ice Cream on Madison Road that afternoon and got a single scoop of black raspberry chip, the kind I always used to get when I was treating myself, and I sat at a table by the window and watched the afternoon foot traffic on the street and thought, this is what it feels like to stop being afraid. It lasted approximately 4 days. The call came on a Monday morning. It was Diane. She didn't raise her voice at first. That wasn't her style. She was cool and deliberate, and she said she had been made aware of my legal actions and that she wanted to discuss them. She used the word discuss the way a cat uses its paw before it extends its claws. I told her there was nothing to discuss. She could speak to my attorney. That was when the temperature changed. Margaret. Her voice dropped in a way I associated with her father. That quiet flattening that meant the pleasant portion of the conversation was over. You need to think very carefully about what you are doing. You are 65 years old. You are alone. You have a son who has a career and a family and a reputation in this city. Do you really want to spend the next 3 years of your life in a courtroom? She paused to let that settle. My father loved you, she said. But he also trusted us to handle certain things. This account is complicated. There are things you don't understand about where that money came from and what it was meant for. You could walk away from this with something reasonable, a settlement, something quiet, and everyone keeps their dignity. I thought about the word dignity. I thought about 5 years of eating soup from cans while making minimum payments on a mortgage I hadn't known existed. "I appreciate the call, Diane," I said. "Carol Simmons will be in touch." I hung up. She called back 4 minutes later from a different number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Barbara, Bob's first wife, Diane's mother, and it was considerably less composed. Barbara's voice was sharp and slightly breathless, and she said that I had always been an outsider in this family, that Bob had confided in them about his finances because he knew I couldn't be trusted to handle complexity, and that I was making a terrible mistake that I would regret for the rest of my life. I saved the voicemail. Then I forwarded it to Carol. 2 days later, Diane appeared at my door. She stood on my front porch in a cream-colored blazer, her hair pulled back, looking polished and calm in the way of someone who has practiced calm. She had brought nothing. She simply stood there. "I'm not going to stop," I said, through the half-open door. "I'm not asking you to stop," she said. "I'm asking you to listen. I've heard what you have to say. My answer is the same." Something moved across her face. Not anger exactly, but the shadow of it, the place where composure breaks just at the edges. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "what you are opening." "Then I suppose I'll find out." I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my heart going fast and uneven in my chest, and I listened to her footsteps cross the porch, descend the steps, and recede down the front walk. Then I went upstairs, drew the curtains, and lay down on my bed in the afternoon light. I slept for 3 hours, the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. I gave myself 4 days. I watched old movies, took long walks around the duck pond, had dinner with Danny, who knew only that I was dealing with some estate things, and who asked careful, non-invasive questions in the way of a son who loves his mother and knows her well enough not to push. On the 5th day, I went back to Carol's office. I was ready to continue. Diane's next move surprised me with its elegance. I had expected escalation. More calls, more pressure, perhaps a letter from whatever attorney she had retained. Instead, 10 days after she had stood on my porch, I received a handwritten card in the mail. Cream envelope, her handwriting. That same large looping script I had seen on the letter to First Fidelity. The note inside said that she had spoken to her mother and that they wanted to meet, not as adversaries, but as family. She suggested lunch at the Precinct, a restaurant on Columbia Parkway that Bob had loved, that I had loved. She said she had something she wanted to share with me, a peace offering, or something dressed as one. I held the card for a long time. What was she offering exactly? A settlement number she thought I'd accept? Information she thought would change my position? Or simply an opportunity to look me in the face, assess how frightened I was, and calibrate her strategy accordingly? I didn't go to the lunch, but I didn't ignore the card either. I photographed it and sent it to Carol, and I wrote back, a single short paragraph, saying that I would not meet outside the presence of my attorney and that any offers should be directed through official channels. Diane did not respond. For 2 weeks, there was silence. It had the particular quality of silence that isn't quiet at all. The kind where you become more, not less, alert. I found myself checking my mailbox with something like dread, watching for unfamiliar cars on the street, going over conversations in my mind and wondering what I might have missed. I knew what I needed. I had lived alone long enough to recognize the signs. I was starting to fold inward, starting to make decisions from a place of fear rather than clarity. I needed someone to talk to. I thought about this for several days before I did anything. I was a private person, had been for most of my life. The years of teaching had given me the performance of confidence, but I had never been someone who asked easily for help. Bob had known this about me. He used to say that I treated vulnerability the way some people treat bad weather. I acknowledged it, dressed appropriately, and went outside anyway. I called my friend Ruth. Ruth Calloway had been my closest friend since 1993, when our sons had played on the same Little League team, and we had spent 2 seasons sitting together on aluminum bleachers, making fun of the parents who screamed at 8-year-olds about their batting stance. She was 71 now, sharp and funny and allergic to nonsense, a retired nurse who had buried one husband and divorced another, and who had a way of listening that made you feel both understood and slightly embarrassed you hadn't figured things out sooner. We met at a coffee shop in Oakley on a Thursday morning. I told her everything. Ruth did not say much while I talked. She stirred her coffee and watched my face and let me get through all of it. The account, the letter in Diane's handwriting, the estate, the debts, the years of quiet diminishment. When I finished, she put her mug down and said, "How long have you known?" "About the account? About 6 weeks?" "No," she said. "How long have you known something was wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't have one ready. "Because I remember," Ruth said, "the Christmas of 2018. You called me after the holidays and you said something about Diane and Bob and you used the word strange. And then you said, 'But I'm probably imagining it,' and changed the subject. I let you change it. I shouldn't have." I thought about that Christmas. Bob had been weaker by then. He had spent most of it in the armchair by the window. Diane had visited alone. Barbara had not come that year. And she and Bob had sat in his study for almost 2 hours with the door closed. I had told myself they were talking about his will, about family matters, the things a father and daughter needed to settle privately. Had she been pressing him then? Had she been trying again to remove my name? Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You are not imagining anything now," she said, "and you are not alone in this." I didn't cry. I had done most of my crying in the first years after Bob died, and I had come out the other side of it with something harder and quieter, where the grief used to be. But I felt something loosen in my chest. Some knot I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was there. I drove home through the spring afternoon, the windows down, the air smelling of cut grass and rain somewhere to the west. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. They came together, which was new. Diane had always operated alone in her dealings with me, presenting a single, controlled front. Barbara I had seen only at rare family occasions, and even then she had maintained a careful peripheral distance, present but not quite engaging, like a figure in the background of a photograph. Seeing them side by side on my doorstep on a Saturday morning was, in itself, information. They were coordinating now. Diane was dressed neatly, as always. Barbara was in her late 70s, slender and angular, with the particular bearing of a woman who had once believed her life would go differently and had never entirely forgiven the world for it. She held a dish covered in foil, a quiche, as it turned out, from a bakery I recognized, the kind of detail designed to make everything seem neighborly and harmless, as though women who had spent 2 years trying to erase my name from a bank account could simply arrive with pastry and reset the terms of everything. I should have turned them away. I knew that even then, but I stepped back from the door and let them in because I wanted to hear what they had decided to say. Sometimes you need to let the other side show their hand. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is stay quiet and listen. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat surrounded by debt notices 5 years ago, where I had sat with my legal pad the morning Thomas Vale called. The table had seen a great deal. Barbara poured coffee. She simply got up and found the mugs and poured with the proprietary ease of someone reclaiming territory. She moved through my kitchen as though she had a right to it, opening the cabinet on the first try, knowing without asking where things were kept. Had Bob described this kitchen to her? Had they spoken about this house, my house, in ways I had never imagined? I noted that. I said nothing. Margaret, Diane began, we understand that you're upset. We understand that this situation looks a certain way from the outside. But there are things about your husband's finances that are more complicated than what you've been told. I'm sure there are, I said. Diane paused at my tone, recalibrated. The account at First Fidelity. That money had a specific purpose. My father set it aside years ago for reasons that were important to him. Family reasons. Before you. Before you. 2 words. Carefully chosen. And yet, I said, my name was on it. As co-beneficiary. For 35 years. He was sentimental, Barbara said. Her voice was dry and precise. He added your name in a moment of sentiment. That doesn't mean the money was ever meant for you to simply take. I looked at her. I thought, you wrote to this man's bank, in his name, trying to erase me. And now you're sitting at his wife's kitchen table, telling me his money was never meant for me. The audacity of it was almost architectural. It had structure. It had scale. It must have taken years to build. I see, I said. Diane leaned forward. Her hands were flat on the table, open, the posture of someone demonstrating honesty. We're prepared to be generous. We're not asking you to walk away with nothing. A settlement? You'd be comfortable. You wouldn't have to go through years of litigation. You wouldn't have to put Danny through that. There it was. Danny, again. The implication that this would somehow damage my son, spill over into his life, become his burden. They had mentioned Danny in the first phone call. They were mentioning him again now. It was not an accident. They had identified him as a pressure point, and they were pressing it with both hands, the way you press a bruise to see how much it still hurts. Danny knows I'm pursuing this, I said. Does he know all of it? Diane asked. Does he know the things my father told us about? She stopped, adjusted. About the state of your marriage in those final years? I felt the air in the kitchen change. What was she suggesting? What exactly was she willing to invent? What version of my marriage was she prepared to construct and present under oath, if it came to that? I felt anger move through me, clean and cold. Not the hot kind that makes you say things you regret, but the kind that focuses you down to a single point. Diane, I said very quietly, I want you to think carefully about what you are about to say, because anything you say to me, I will repeat under oath, and anything you cannot prove, you will be accountable for. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Barbara set her coffee mug down with a small, hard sound. You are making a mistake, she said. You are an old woman living alone, and you have no idea what this family is capable of. I expect I'll find out, I said. You're welcome to leave the quiche. Diane stood. Her face had gone very still, the composure restored but thinner now, like paint over a crack. She looked at me with something I can only describe as assessment. The look of someone recalculating, deciding whether to change tactics or simply increase pressure. She chose neither. She walked to the front door, her mother behind her. Before she stepped outside, she turned back once. This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said. For which of us? I asked. She left without answering. I locked the door and stood in the hallway and breathed. My hands were steady, but my heart was moving quickly, that bright, specific fear that sharpens everything. What had Diane almost said? What was she willing to claim about Bob, about our marriage, about me? How far would two women go when they understood that losing meant losing everything they had spent years quietly, carefully arranging? I picked up my phone and called Carol. Then I called Ruth. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out everything they had said, word by word, while it was still fresh. Every inflection I could remember, every pause, the way Barbara had poured the coffee, the way Diane's hands had been flat on the table. Fear, I had learned, was not the opposite of courage. It was the fuel. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late September at Carol's office in Blue Ash. I had been preparing for it for months, not only legally, but in the way I used to prepare for the hardest parent-teacher conferences of my career, by knowing more than the other person expected me to know, and by keeping my face completely neutral when I used it. I had learned in 30 years of teaching that the most powerful position in any room is the one where you know exactly what is coming and the other person believes you don't. Carol had been thorough. Through the formal discovery process, she had obtained Gerald Pruitt's communications with Diane going back to 2016. Emails, not phone calls, because Pruitt had been careless in ways that careful people often are when they believe the other side isn't looking. The emails were not explicit. They never said, "Help us hide this account," or "Keep the wife in the dark." But they established a pattern of contact between Pruitt and Diane during the estate proceedings that had not been disclosed to me, and they included one exchange dated 3 weeks before I signed the estate documents, in which Diane asked Pruitt to keep the First Fidelity matter out of the summary she'll receive. And Pruitt had replied with 2 words: "Understood. Done." 2 words, 37 characters, the entire architecture of the last 5 years. I had read that email perhaps 40 times in the weeks before the deposition, not because I needed to memorize it. I had memorized it within the first reading, but because each time I read it, I felt something settle more firmly into place. 2 people had sat with the knowledge of what I was owed and had decided together that I should not have it. Not because I had done anything wrong, simply because they had decided that I did not matter enough to tell the truth to. The deposition room was a conference room with gray carpeting and a long table and water glasses that nobody touched. Carol sat beside me. Across the table were Diane, her attorney, a man named Stephen Breck, who had the look of someone accustomed to winning on paperwork. And beside him, a visibly aged Gerald Pruitt, who had lost weight and whose hands, I noticed, were not quite still. Barbara was not there. She had submitted a written statement through Breck. She had, it seemed, decided to maintain distance. That, too, was information. When the pressure becomes real, you find out quickly who trusts whom and how much. Diane looked composed when she came in. She was dressed professionally, her posture correct, her expression arranged in the serene certainty of someone who has been told by their attorney that everything is under control. Carol opened by introducing the First Fidelity Trust documentation, the account history, the co-beneficiary designation, the balance at the time of Bob's death. Then she introduced the letter, the original inquiry letter submitted to First Fidelity in September 2017, asking about the removal of a co-beneficiary. She placed a copy in front of Diane and asked her to look at it. Diane looked at it. "Can you identify the handwriting in this letter?" Carol asked. "I can't say for certain," Diane said. "Take your time." "I really can't say." Carol then produced a comparison document, a card Diane had sent me at Christmas 2018, which I had provided with Diane's handwriting. She placed it beside the letter. The room was very quiet. Stephen Breck said something about the reliability of handwriting comparison, and Carol acknowledged it smoothly and said that the documents had been reviewed by a certified forensic document examiner retained by our side, and that she would be submitting the expert's report as an exhibit. Diane's composure did not break, but something behind it shifted, something in the set of her jaw, the small adjustment of her eyes. She had walked into this room believing she could hold the line of, "I don't recall." She was beginning to understand that the line had already been cut from behind. "Ms. Harlow Cross," Carol said, "were you aware of the First Fidelity Trust account during your father's lifetime?" "My father discussed various financial matters with me, yes." "Were you aware of the account at the time of your father's death?" "I was aware that he had various accounts." "Were you aware of this specific account when you participated in discussions with Gerald Pruitt regarding the estate settlement?" A pause. Breck leaned over and said something quietly. Diane said, "I don't recall the specific details of every account discussed." Carol let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Then she placed the email exchange in front of Pruitt. Pruitt stared at it. He looked, for a moment, like a man watching a wall he had built very carefully simply fall. His hands on the table were still now, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped trying to control their composure and moved into something beyond it. Carol addressed him directly. "Mr. Pruitt, this email, dated October 14th, 2019, contains your written response to a request from Diane Harlow Cross to exclude, and I'm quoting, the First Fidelity matter from documentation provided to Margaret Harlow during estate proceedings. Your response was, 'Understood. Done.' Is this your email address in the header?" Breck objected. "It was overruled. This was a deposition." "Yes," Pruitt said. His voice was barely audible. "Is this your reply?" A longer pause. In the silence, I could hear the faint sound of traffic from the street outside, ordinary life continuing in its ordinary way, indifferent to what was being confirmed in this gray-carpeted room. "Yes." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Diane turned to look at Pruitt. It was an involuntary movement. She couldn't help it. And in it, I saw everything. The recognition that he had just confirmed what they had both agreed not to confirm. That the careful architecture of I don't recall and various accounts had just been structurally undermined by a 2-word email reply a tired attorney had sent 3 years ago and forgotten about. The look she gave him lasted less than 2 seconds. But it contained, in that brief flash, something very close to fury. I kept my face still. I thought about the kitchen floor where I had sat after Thomas Vale called, the soup cans, the legal pad, the 5 years of quiet, grinding diminishment. I thought, here we are. The deposition was the beginning of the end, not the end itself. Legal proceedings moved slowly, and the months that followed required patience I didn't always have. There were motions filed and countered, additional discovery requests, a mediation session in January that lasted 6 hours and resolved nothing because Diane's team still believed they had enough uncertainty to work with. They didn't. But they needed to arrive at that conclusion themselves, and no amount of evidence, it turned out, accelerates the speed at which a person accepts that they have lost. The moment they arrived was a Thursday in March, almost a full year after Thomas Vale's phone call, when Stephen Breck contacted Carol and said his client was prepared to discuss settlement. Carol called me that afternoon. I was in the park, on the bench near the duck pond where I had sat so many times in the past year, working things through. The sky was flat and gray, and the ducks were moving in their indifferent circles, and my phone rang. "They want to talk," Carol said. "What changed?" I asked. "The Board of Professional Conduct issued its preliminary findings on Pruitt this morning. He's facing disbarment. His attorney has advised him to cooperate with us fully in exchange for consideration on the civil claims. He's prepared to provide a complete sworn statement." That was what had changed. When Gerald Pruitt decided that protecting Diane was no longer worth the destruction of his own career and reputation, the entire structure they had built collapsed. It had always depended on his silence. The moment he chose otherwise, there was nothing left to hold it up. A conspiracy is only as strong as the willingness of its participants to keep paying the cost. And for Pruitt, the cost had finally exceeded what he was prepared to pay. We did not settle. I want to be clear about that. Stephen Breck proposed settlement 3 times over the following 6 weeks, and 3 times Carol and I declined. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple calculation that what a court would award us given Pruitt's forthcoming testimony and the documentary evidence we had assembled was substantially more than anything Diane was willing to offer voluntarily. She was still, even then, trying to limit the damage. She was still, even at that stage, trying to control what the outcome looked like. I had spent 5 years having things controlled for me. I was done with that. The case went before a judge in Hamilton County in April. It was not a long trial. Complex cases sometimes aren't when the documentary record is complete. The forensic examiner confirmed the handwriting. Pruitt testified under oath that Diane had known about the First Fidelity account before Bob's death and had instructed him to exclude it from estate documentation. He testified that Barbara had been present at least one conversation where the account's concealment was discussed. He testified that he had complied, that he had rationalized it as serving his longtime client's wishes, and that he understood now the harm it had caused. He looked at me once while he said this. His face had the gray, collapsed look of a man who had rehearsed a version of himself for decades and was finally watching it disassemble in public. I felt no particular satisfaction in it. What I felt was more like recognition, the acknowledgement of a truth that had existed all along, finally said aloud in a room that would record it. I didn't look away. Diane sat at the respondents' table throughout with the rigid stillness of someone using every available unit of self-control. She did not testify in her own defense in any meaningful way. Breck had clearly advised her against it, knowing that Carol's cross-examination would be methodical and that Diane's habit of careful misdirection would not hold up under sustained direct questioning. She said very little. For a woman who had spent years managing information, managing perception, managing what I knew and what I didn't, the silence must have cost her considerably. The judge ruled in my favor on all primary claims. The full balance of the First Fidelity account, which I will now tell you, was $2.3 million, accumulated over 40 years of quiet, steady deposits by a man who had, whatever his failings in speech, kept his promise in writing, was awarded to me as the lawful co-beneficiary. The estate debt was legally recategorized, and a portion was determined to have been improperly attributed to the marital estate. I was awarded damages for this as well. In total, the judgment came to just over $2.6 million. Diane was ordered to pay legal fees. Gerald Pruitt was separately liable for damages related to his professional negligence and was formally referred to the bar for disciplinary proceedings. The Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct, acting on the complaint Carol had filed the previous spring, revoked his license to practice law 4 months after the judgment. Barbara issued no public statement. She had, throughout the trial, maintained a silence that was either strategic or simply the retreat of someone who had finally understood the full weight of what had been done. I did not know which. I did not go looking for the answer. Diane appealed. Her attorney filed the appeal in May, and the appellate court denied it in August. I was notified by Carol on a Tuesday morning. I was at home, drinking coffee at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this had begun. And when she told me the denial had come through and the judgment was final and unappealable, I said thank you and hung up. and sat very still for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The morning light came through the curtains the same way it always had. Nothing looked different, and everything was. Then I called Danny. I called Ruth. I called my sister in Portland. Each call was short. There were no dramatic speeches, no lengthy declarations. Just the same 3 words, spoken 3 times. It's over. We won. The money was transferred to my account in September. I remember the moment the confirmation email arrived. An ordinary-looking email. Standard bank formatting, sitting in my inbox between a grocery store promotion and a note from the library about a book on hold. I printed it. I folded it carefully and put it in the same folder where I had kept, for a year, every document, every note, every photograph of every piece of evidence that had brought me to this place. Then I went to Graeter's. Single scoop, black raspberry chip. I sat by the window and watched the street and didn't think about anything in particular. It was enough. I did not leave Cincinnati. People assumed I would. That the first thing I'd do with the money would be to sell the house on Westover Hills Boulevard and move somewhere warm and far away, to start clean. But I had lived in that city for 40 years, and I had walked out of that house every morning through the worst of everything, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me, not even by moving. What I did was fix the roof, which had needed it for 3 years. Then I repaid the debts. All of them, in full, in a single afternoon, sitting at my computer with a cup of tea, paying off account after account, with the concentrated pleasure of someone finally setting down a very heavy bag. The second mortgage, the line of credit, the medical bills. Numbers that had lived in my head like a low, persistent noise for 5 years. And then they were gone. The silence afterward was remarkable. In the spring, I sold the house. Not in retreat, but because I found something I loved more. A craftsman bungalow 3 miles away in Oakley, closer to Ruth. 2 blocks from the coffee shop where we'd had our Thursday morning conversations all through the previous year. It had original hardwood floors and a front porch with 2 chairs and a garden in the back that had been left to grow wild. I spent that first summer putting it in order. Tomatoes, zucchini, black-eyed Susans along the fence line. The physical work of it was a pleasure I hadn't expected. Danny and his wife came for a long weekend in July. My granddaughter, who was 4, helped me water the garden and announced with great authority that the tomatoes were not ready yet. I took her to the duck pond. She named all of the ducks. She named them things like Gerald and Patricia and Soup, which made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in a very long time. I began to volunteer again, at the elementary school 6 blocks from my new house, tutoring reading twice a week, sitting across from a 7-year-old who is sounding out a word for the first time, watching the moment they get it. There is nothing quite like that. I had missed it. I hadn't known how much until I walked back into that room. Ruth and I joined a book club that met on the first Wednesday of every month at a wine bar on Hyde Park Square. The books were sometimes excellent and sometimes terrible, and the discussion was frequently more about the members' lives than the actual text, which was, I decided, exactly as it should be. I thought about Bob. I would be lying if I said otherwise. I thought about him often, not with the raw grief of the first years, but with something more complex, more textured. I had loved him. I believed in the part of me that had known him longest, that he had loved me. The account was real. His intention, whatever its complications, had been real. He had added my name in 1989 and had kept it there through everything. And I thought sometimes that this was the most honest thing he had ever told me, that he had said it not in words but in paperwork, quietly and without ceremony. the way he had done most things. I didn't forgive him entirely for the silence, but I understood it better as time went on. As for Diane and Barbara, I did not follow their lives with any satisfaction. But facts are facts, and this is what reached me in the ordinary way that news travels in a city where people know each other. Diane's real estate business in Louisville had been struggling before the trial. The legal fees, substantial given the length of the proceedings, had compounded problems that already existed. She sold her house in the Highlands neighborhood in November of that year, and a mutual acquaintance mentioned, without particular emphasis, that she had moved into a smaller rental. Whether the business had fully closed or simply contracted, I didn't know and didn't ask. Barbara had a health episode in the winter, a fall at home, a fracture that required recovery in a rehabilitation facility. She had no husband, limited income, and Diane, as far as anyone could tell, was in no position to be a reliable source of support. It was, I thought, a hard way to spend your late 70s. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt, if I'm honest, something closer to sad. Life had given them choices. They had chosen poorly, and in the end the ledger balanced itself, the way ledgers generally do. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet and merciless arithmetic of consequence. Gerald Pruitt moved to Florida, his license revoked, his reputation in Cincinnati reduced to a cautionary anecdote told in legal circles. I did not think about them often. There was too much living to do. My name is Peggy Harlow, and for 5 years I believed the story I had been handed. Then I stopped believing it, and everything changed. What I learned: trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Get your own attorney. Read every document before you sign it. And never, ever let anyone convince you that the truth is too complicated for you to understand. You are capable of more than they think. I was. So, what would you have done? If this story moved you, please share it. Leave a comment. And thank you, sincerely, for listening all the way to the end. While sorting through my late husband's belongings, I found an envelope with an address, open only after my death, without the children. I went to that address and saw a house. When I knocked on the door, a woman answered who introduced herself as, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew every corner of my life. That sounds foolish now. The kind of thing a woman says before she learns the truth. But back then, sitting in the kitchen of our house in Davenport, Iowa, watching the morning light come through the yellow curtains I had sewn myself 31 years ago, I genuinely believed I understood the shape of my existence. I knew which drawer the batteries lived in. I knew that Ronald took his coffee with 1 sugar and a splash of cream, that he snored on his back and slept quietly on his side, that he hummed old Hank Williams songs while he raked leaves in October. I knew the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, that particular low rumble, and I knew without looking up from whatever I was doing that it was him and not someone else. We had raised 2 children in that house. Thomas, who now lived in Portland with his wife and twin girls, and Karen, settled in Nashville, building a career in hospital administration. We had grandchildren who called on Sundays and visited at Christmas. We had a life that was, if not spectacular, then solid. Real. The kind of life that doesn't photograph well, but feels like something when you're standing inside it. Ronald retired from his position as a civil engineer at 58 and took up woodworking in the garage. He built birdhouses, bookshelves, a rocking chair that sat on the porch for years. He was quiet by nature. Not cold, just contained. He said what he meant, and rarely more. I loved him for that, or I loved what I thought that was. The first signs, I realize now, had been there for years. I simply hadn't looked at them directly. There were the phone calls he took in the garage. Not every day, but often enough, maybe once every 2 weeks. He would step away from dinner or from the television and walk out through the back door with his cell phone pressed to his ear. When I asked once who it was, he said it was a former colleague dealing with a difficult situation. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We had been married for 34 years. A person builds trust like a house, one ordinary day at a time, and by the time we were in our 60s, ours felt immovable. There was the credit card statement I found in March of 2019, the one with a charge from a florist in Columbus, Ohio. We had not been to Columbus. I hadn't received flowers. I held the paper and looked at the number, $47. And then I set it down and made lunch. I told myself there was an explanation. There always is, isn't there? And if you love someone, you choose the explanation that lets you go on loving them. There were the 2 days in November when he told me he was visiting an old Army buddy in Cincinnati. He came back quieter than usual and went straight to the garage. I noticed, but I did not ask. That is the honest truth of it. I noticed, and I did not ask, because some part of me already understood that asking might cost me more than I was willing to pay. Ronald was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021. It moved fast, the way that particular disease does. By autumn, he was in home hospice, and by November, he was gone. I held his hand at the end. He looked at me with those pale blue eyes, and I thought I saw something there. Not just love, but something strained, like a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. I didn't understand what it meant until 8 months later, when I was finally ready to go through his desk. The house had been quiet for most of that time. Thomas and Karen had come for the funeral and stayed a week, and then life had pulled them back to their own corners of the country. I had learned, slowly, how to move through the rooms alone, how to make coffee for one, how to sleep in the center of the bed. It was a Tuesday in July when I sat down at Ronald's old oak desk and began going through the drawers. There were the usual things: warranties for appliances we no longer owned, a folder of tax returns going back to 1987, a collection of golf pencils. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a folded road atlas, I found a white business envelope. On the front, in Ronald's careful handwriting, were 2 lines: "Open only after my death." Not with the children. I sat very still for a long moment. Outside, a lawnmower was running somewhere down the street. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday sound. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card with a name and an address in Columbus, Ohio. No explanation, no letter. Just the name, Diana Cole, 412 West Haven Drive. And beneath it, in smaller letters, "You deserve to know." I set the card on the desk and pressed both hands flat against the wood to stop them from shaking. You deserve to know. What does a man mean, I thought, when he leaves those words behind? I did not sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning with a cup of tea that went cold. The index card on the table in front of me like something living. Diana Cole, 412 West Haven Drive, Columbus, Ohio. A name I had never heard. An address 3 hours from my front door. I tried to be rational about it. Ronald was gone. Whatever this was, whatever this had been, it couldn't hurt him now. The only person it could hurt was me. And I was 68 years old, a grandmother twice over. And I had survived the death of a husband. Surely, I told myself, I could survive this too. But the mind doesn't follow instructions like that, does it? By 3 in the morning, I had done the arithmetic that no wife wants to do. The florist charge in Columbus, March 2019. The Cincinnati trip in November of that same year. 2 more colleague phone calls I suddenly remembered from the following spring. A pattern that had been invisible to me while I was living inside it, but which looked perfectly clear now, laid out in sequence like tiles on a floor. 34 years. I kept coming back to that number. 34 years, 2 children, a house with yellow curtains, a porch rocking chair he built with his own hands. How long, I thought? How long and how much of what I believed was real? By 4, I had moved from grief to something cooler. I recognized the feeling. I had felt it once before, when Thomas was 16, and I discovered he had been lying to us for months about where he was going on weekends. That same shift from hurt to clarity. Emotion doesn't leave. It just steps back and lets you think. What did I actually know? I knew a name and an address. I knew Ronald had wanted me to find it. He had written the card himself, sealed it, left it where I would find it. That mattered. He hadn't simply hidden this from me. He had chosen at the end to give me the means to discover it. You deserve to know. Why? What was I supposed to know? I thought about calling Karen. She would be sympathetic, but she would also try to manage the situation, the way she managed everything, with careful language and calm suggestions and an underlying urgency to resolve things quickly. Thomas would be gentler, but more lost. Neither of them knew their father the way I did, or the way I had thought I did. No, this was mine to carry first. Over the following 2 days, I began making a quiet inventory of our financial life, the kind of review I had never had reason to do before, because Ronald had always handled the accounts. I was not a passive woman. I had worked as a school librarian for 22 years. I managed the household. I made my own decisions. But our finances had been his domain, and I had allowed that. Now I wished, bitterly, that I had paid closer attention. I went through our joint checking account, normal, expected. The retirement accounts, present and accounted for. The savings account that we had agreed on together over the years, yes, it was there. But then I found the credit union statement in a folder I had never seen before. A separate account, opened in 2009, in Ronald's name only. The balance at the time of his death was $47,000. I sat down on the floor of his study, just sat down, right there on the carpet, and stared at the paper. $47,000, saved over 14 years in an account I had never been told about. What was it for? Was it for her? Was it a safety net? Was it guilt made into a number? I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the month since the funeral. Instead, I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of cold, determined weight, like a stone that has found its place at the bottom of a river. I was going to go to Columbus. Not that day, not without preparation. I was not a woman who acted on impulse. I had lived long enough to know that decisions made in the heat of shock are rarely the right ones. I would take a week. I would find out everything I could about Diana Cole before I knocked on her door. I would know what I was walking into before I walked into it. I went to the library, my old library, where I still knew the staff, and sat at the computer for 2 hours. Diana Cole, Columbus, Ohio. She was 61 years old, according to public records. She worked in healthcare administration. She owned the house on West Haven Drive outright. It had been purchased in 2010. She had 1 daughter, a woman named Brittany Cole, 34, who appeared to share the West Haven address, The house purchased in 2010. The secret account opened in 2009. The stone in my chest grew heavier. I drove home and sat on the porch in the rocking chair Ronald had built, and I looked at the yard he had mowed every Saturday from April to October for 30 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what was in front of me. Then I went inside, made dinner, and began to plan. The law office of Patricia Ellman was on the second floor of a brick building on Brady Street, above a dry cleaner and a small insurance office. I had driven past it 100 times without ever having a reason to go in. Now I sat in a leather chair across from a woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a legal pad in front of her, and I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. That was the first thing I liked about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, writing something. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "I want to be clear about a few things. The account in your late husband's name, depending on your state statutes and the terms of your marital estate, may well be considered marital property. The same applies to any assets that may have been directed to a third party during the marriage." "You mean gifts?" I said. "Money? Potentially, yes." She held my gaze. If funds were transferred from marital assets to this woman, for the purchase of a home, for instance, those transfers could be considered dissipation of marital assets, even post-mortem, in terms of your claim to the estate. I had not known the legal term before that morning. Dissipation of marital assets. The phrase had the precision of a surgical instrument. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Document everything," she said. "Before you contact anyone, before you make that drive to Columbus." I spent the following week doing exactly that. Patricia's paralegal, a quiet young man named Marcus, helped me request records. Bank records, property transaction histories, anything that was publicly accessible. I photocopied every statement from the secret credit union account. I organized the florist charge, the Columbus dates, the phone records I requested from Ronald's carrier, which it turned out I had legal access to as the executor of his estate. The phone records were the most difficult to read. There were calls to a Columbus number, the number registered to the West Haven Drive address, going back to 2008. At first, once every 2 weeks, then once a week. Then, in the years before his diagnosis, sometimes daily. In the month before he entered hospice, the calls had stopped. I assumed he had been too ill. Or perhaps he had told her. Had he told her he was dying? Had she known he had a wife, a home, children in Portland and Nashville? These were questions I couldn't answer from a distance. They were questions I would have to ask in person. But something happened before I made that drive. Something I hadn't anticipated. On a Thursday morning, 11 days after I had found the envelope, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Columbus area code. The voice on the other end was young, carefully controlled. "Is this Marjorie Hayes?" "It is," I said. A pause. "My name is Brittany Cole. I think you've been asking questions about my mother." I was standing in my kitchen. I pressed my hand against the counter. "I have been gathering information, yes," I said. "That is my right. I just want to understand what you're planning." Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something else. Was it nervousness? Preparation? "My mother is a private person. She's already grieving." That word landed like something thrown. "Grieving?" "Yes," I said after a moment. "So am I." Brittany Cole said nothing. "I'll be in Columbus next week," I said. "I think we all have things we deserve to understand." I ended the call before she could respond. My hand was shaking slightly. I set the phone on the counter and stood very still in thought. She called to warn me off, not to explain, not to apologize. to warn me, which meant they had something to protect. That afternoon, Marcus emailed me the property records for 412 West Haven Drive. The home had been purchased in June 2010 for $218,000. The deed listed Diana Cole as sole owner. But the down payment, $54,000, had been made by wire transfer from an account I didn't recognize. I brought the routing number to Patricia that same afternoon. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly, "this account was opened by Ronald in 2009. The one you found the statements for. The $47,000 remaining in the account. The $54,000 wire transfer in 2010. He had funded her house. I sat with that for a long moment. The full, undeniable weight of it. Not suspicion any longer. Not the soft anxiety of a wife who noticed phone calls and chose not to ask. This was a document. A number. A wire transfer with a date and a source. There was no version of this that I had been wrong about. "What are my options?" I said. Patricia folded her hands. "Significant ones," she said. I drove home in the early evening, the sky going orange over the river, and I felt, for the first time since I had found that envelope, something that wasn't grief or fear. I felt ready. I drove to Columbus on a Wednesday morning in late August. I had asked Patricia whether she thought it was safe to go alone, and she had said, "Legally, you have every right to speak to a private citizen on public property. Keep it to the doorstep if you can. Don't go inside unless you feel completely comfortable." I had taken note of that and packed light. A folder of documents, a small recording device that Patricia had confirmed was legal to use in Ohio under single-party consent law, and the index card, which I had carried with me since I found it. The drive through Ohio was flat and golden with late summer. I listened to the radio and drank coffee from a travel mug and tried to feel ordinary. It almost worked. West Haven Drive was a quiet residential street, ranch-style houses, mature trees, the particular stillness of a neighborhood where most people were at work by mid-morning. Number 412 had a neat front yard, a flower bed with late-season zinnias, a wind chime by the door. She had made a home here, with his money, while I was in Davenport sewing curtains and raising children and believing in my marriage. I knocked. The woman who answered the door was small, perhaps 5'3", with dark gray hair cut to her jaw and careful eyes. She knew immediately who I was. I could see it in the way her expression shifted, not to surprise, but to something prepared. "You must be Marjorie," she said. "I am," I said. "And you're Diana." She stepped back. "Come in." I had intended to stay on the doorstep, but I went in. The living room was comfortable and tasteful. A woman who had made her life deliberately with attention. There were photographs on a shelf. In one of them, I saw Ronald. Younger, maybe 10 years ago, standing at a lake with Diana beside him and a younger Brittany behind them. A family portrait. I stood in front of it for a moment without speaking. Diana sat down on the sofa and folded her hands. "I don't know what he told you," she said, "or what he left you. But I want you to know I didn't know about you for the first 2 years. "And after 2 years?" I said. She didn't answer that. I sat down across from her and opened my folder. I laid the wire transfer record on the coffee table between us. "He used marital assets to purchase this house," I said. $54,000 from an account I was not informed of. My attorney has documented the transfer." The composure on Diana's face tightened. "This house is mine," she said. "My name is on the deed." "Your name is on the deed," I agreed. "But the funds used were marital property. I have a claim to those assets as part of the estate settlement." That was when Brittany came in. She had been somewhere in the back of the house. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. She was tall, with her mother's careful eyes, and something harder underneath them. She stood in the doorway and looked at me the way people look at problems. "I think you should leave," she said. "Brittany," Diana started. "No, Mom." She moved into the room. "You're harassing my mother in her own home. I can call the police right now." I looked at her steadily. "You're welcome to do that," I said. "I'm sitting quietly in a room I was invited into, speaking with a woman who was involved with my husband for many years using my family's money. I'd be interested to have that conversation in front of police." Brittany's jaw tightened. "Furthermore," I said, and I reached into the folder and removed Patricia's letter, a formal notice of claim against the estate and related assets, and set it on the table. "My attorney has filed a preliminary claim. You'll both be contacted through proper legal channels. This visit was simply a courtesy." The silence in the room was complete. Then Brittany said, in a voice that had dropped to something close and controlled, "If you pursue this, I will make sure your children know every detail of their father's private life. I have letters, emails. I will make it very public. I will make sure it follows your family." I sat for a moment with that threat. Then I picked up my folder, stood, and looked at her. "My children," I said, "deserve the truth about their father. If you release those letters, you'll be saving me a difficult conversation." I picked up my bag. "Good afternoon." I drove back to Davenport through the golden Ohio afternoon, and I stopped at a diner in Springfield and ate a bowl of soup and a piece of pie. And I sat there for 40 minutes looking out the window at the parking lot, letting the drive go out of me. When I got home, I called Patricia and told her what had occurred. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You handled that exactly right. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next." The threat Brittany had made sat in me, not paralyzing, but present. The following Friday, I drove up to Portland to see Thomas and spent 4 days with him and his wife and the girls. I didn't tell him everything yet. I just needed to be somewhere that felt like family. By the time I drove home, I was steady again. The call came on a Monday. I had been in the garden, the one along the back fence where I grow tomatoes every year and zinnias because they ask for almost nothing. My phone was in my pocket, a habit I had developed since the Columbus visit, not wanting to miss anything that mattered. It was Diana. Her voice was different from the meeting on West Haven Drive, less defended, more careful. The voice of someone who had rehearsed. "Marjorie," she said, "I've been thinking. I believe we got off to a very difficult start, and I take responsibility for some of that." A pause. "I want you to know that I never wanted to cause you harm. I know that's hard to believe." I stood among the tomato plants and said nothing. "I was thinking," she continued, "that perhaps there's a way to resolve this that doesn't require lawyers and courts. Ronald wouldn't have wanted this. You know that. Ronald wouldn't have wanted this." She said his name easily, the way you say the name of someone you knew well. "What are you proposing?" I said. "A settlement," she said. "Between us, privately. I keep the house, you keep the estate accounts, and we both move on with our lives. No courts, no publicity, no pain for your children." I pulled a small weed from between the tomato stakes with my free hand. "I'll think about it," I said. "I'm glad to hear." I said I'll think about it, I repeated evenly. "I'll be in touch through my attorney." I ended the call. I stood there for a moment in the garden, and I noticed something. I wasn't tempted. Not in the way I might have been 3 months ago, when this was new and everything hurt in the raw, open way of a fresh loss. Now the hurt had had time to settle into shape, and its shape was clear. This was not about money alone. It was about what Ronald had taken from me when he built a life in Columbus. Not just money, but the certainty that what I had known was real. You cannot settle a claim like that with a private agreement. I called Patricia that afternoon and relayed the offer. "What would you like to do?" she asked. "Decline," I said. Formally, through you. Noted. I could hear the slight approval in her voice. That same week, I had dinner with my oldest friend, Connie Marsh. We had known each other since our sons were in first grade together. Nearly 40 years. She was the one person outside of Karen and Thomas whom I trusted entirely. I had not told her the full story yet. I had given her pieces, enough that she knew something was happening, not enough that I felt exposed. That evening, I told her everything. Connie was the kind of woman who didn't fill silences with unnecessary sounds. She listened. She asked questions that were precise and unsentimental. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Ronnie always did like to keep his hands in things." I laughed. A short, genuine laugh, the first one in weeks. It felt strange and necessary. "You're not alone in this," she said. "Whatever you need." I drove home from Connie's house that night through the familiar streets of Davenport, the river dark and wide in the distance, the old brick storefronts lit from inside, and I thought, this is my city, my life. I built it too. I was not going to be managed out of it. They came on a Saturday morning. I was not expecting them. They had not called ahead, which told me something. A woman who calls ahead is asking permission. A woman who arrives unannounced is trying to remove your ability to prepare. I heard the car in the driveway and looked out the kitchen window. A silver sedan I didn't recognize. Diana got out first, in a beige blazer and pressed slacks, carrying what appeared to be a small arrangement of flowers. Brittany came behind her, in dark clothes, her expression neutral. Flowers. I noticed that. The same kind of flowers, I thought, that a person brings to a funeral. A gesture designed to signal goodwill while reminding you, underneath, of loss. I went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. I wanted them to know that I had seen them coming, that I had been watching. Diana smiled, a careful, practiced warmth. "Marjorie, I hope we're not disturbing you." She held out the flowers. We wanted to talk face to face, without lawyers. I looked at the flowers and then at her. "Come in," I said. I did not put the flowers in water. We sat in the living room, me in Ronald's old chair, Diana on the sofa, Brittany at the edge of the sofa nearest the door, as if positioning herself. I brought no coffee. This was not a social call, and I didn't see the value in pretending otherwise. The three of us sat in a room full of Ronald's absence, and I let that silence do its work for a moment before anyone spoke. Diana began with the softer approach. She talked about grief. She talked about how strange and painful the last year had been for everyone involved. She talked about Ronald, how much he had loved everyone, how complicated he was, how she believed that love, even when imperfect, was still real. She spoke carefully, with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed in the car on the way over. I listened without interrupting. I had learned in 50 years of dealing with people, students, parents, colleagues, my own children, that the most useful thing you can do when someone is performing for you is to let the performance finish. Then she shifted. Subtle at first, the way a conversation tilts when someone decides they've been patient long enough. "Marjorie, I think we both know that going through the courts is going to be painful for everyone involved. Your grandchildren will hear about this. The community you've lived in for 30 years will hear about it. Is that really what you want at this stage of your life?" At this stage of your life. The phrase was chosen with precision. I was supposed to hear, "You're too old and too tired for this fight. Take the quiet exit." "I'm 68, I said, "not incapacitated." She held her smile. "Of course not. I only mean—" "Brittany," I said, turning to look at her directly, "did you have something you wanted to add?" Brittany had been sitting silently, watching her mother work. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, that I had named her before she was ready. She leaned forward. My mother gave 30 years of her life to a man who never had the courage to make a real decision. She built a life. She deserves stability. I gave 34 years to the same man, I said. I was his wife. A legal title, Brittany said. An accurate one, I replied. Brittany's composure shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to see what was underneath it. The patience she had been wearing like a coat came off. If you file that claim, she said, I will contact every local paper, every community group you're involved with. I'll make sure that the story of your marriage, the full story, is told publicly. I have emails. I have photographs. And I won't be gentle about how I tell it. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the tomatoes in the back garden. I thought about the rocking chair on the porch. I thought about a Tuesday morning and an index card in a bottom drawer. Brittany, I said, you've threatened that before. In your mother's living room the first time I came to Columbus. I made a note of it then, and I'm making a note of it now. My attorney has been informed of the prior threat. If you follow through on it, you will be engaging in conduct that has a specific legal name. I paused and let that settle. Have you spoken with your own lawyer about the word extortion? The room went very still. The kind of still that has weight. Diana put a hand on Brittany's arm. A quick, pressing gesture. Brittany sat back. Her jaw was tight, her eyes sharp, but she said nothing more. I think, Diana said quietly, and her voice had lost its rehearsed warmth entirely now, that this visit was a mistake. I don't think it was a mistake, I said. I think it was necessary. Now you understand clearly that I am not going to change my position. And I understand that you are not willing to engage in good faith. That's useful information for everyone in this room. They left 7 minutes later. I stood in the doorway and watched the silver sedan back out of the driveway, Brittany driving too fast, the tires cutting sharply on the turn. I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while with my hands flat on the counter. I won't claim I felt nothing. My pulse was elevated, and there was a low, persistent hum of something in my chest that could only be called fear. Not the sharp fear of an immediate threat, but the slower kind. What if they do it? What will the grandchildren one day understand about their grandfather? What will 30 years of neighbors think when they read a headline? But underneath that fear was something more durable. The cold, settled weight I had first felt in Patricia's office. And now, reinforced by everything that had happened in this room, a resolve that had less to do with winning and more to do with something I could only call self-respect. I was right. They were wrong. They had come here hoping to find a woman who could be frightened or flattered or worn down by proximity. They had found something else. I called Connie that evening and told her what had happened. Good, she said simply. No elaboration, no softening, just good. And in her voice, it meant everything it needed to mean. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table and worked through the next steps, one by one, in the deliberate way I had been doing things since July. Methodical, clear-eyed, unhurried. The mediation was scheduled for October in a neutral conference room at a law office in Columbus. Patricia had advised mediation before any court filing, as it was faster and, if successful, would save everyone considerable cost. What she did not say, but what I understood, was that mediation had another purpose. It put Diana and Brittany in a room with the documents. I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore a dark blue dress that Karen had given me for my birthday 2 years ago, and I brought my folder, now thick with documentation, and a yellow legal pad on which I had written in my own hand a timeline of every financial transaction we had traced. Diana arrived with a lawyer I didn't recognize. A young man in a new suit who looked slightly underprepared. Brittany sat beside her mother in a charcoal blazer, her arms crossed. Patricia sat beside me, unhurried. The mediator, a retired judge named Howard Greer in his early 70s, asked each side to present their position. Diana's lawyer spoke first. He argued that the assets in question had been gifted freely by Ronald, that Diana had no knowledge of any claim against those assets, and that as Ronald was deceased, the question of intent was unprovable. Patricia waited. Then she laid out our documents in sequence, precisely and without drama. The credit union account, opened 2009. The wire transfer to the West Haven property, June 2010. The phone records showing 14 years of regular contact. A second discovery. One that Marcus had found in the final week. A life insurance policy, mid-tier, that Ronald had taken out in 2012, naming Diana Cole as a secondary beneficiary. That last item landed visibly. Brittany sat up. Diana's lawyer touched his pen to his pad and wrote something without speaking. Judge Greer looked at the documents for a long time. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "you've been very thorough." "I had time," I said. Across the table, I watched Diana. She was looking at the insurance document, and in her face, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not the careful preparation of the West Haven doorstep, not the practiced warmth of the Saturday morning visit. I saw exhaustion. A woman who had held a complicated thing together for a very long time and was now watching the structure of it become visible in a conference room under fluorescent lights. I found, unexpectedly, that I felt something for her that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite understanding. It was closer to recognition. She had loved him too, or something she had called love. She had made a life around a man who had never fully committed to it. In that, we were not entirely unalike. Brittany did not have her mother's weariness. Halfway through the session, when Patricia laid out the secondary beneficiary finding, she interrupted the mediator. "This is a selective presentation," she said. "My mother was part of his life for 30 years. You can't reduce that to a wire transfer." "Ms. Cole," Judge Greer said calmly, "you'll have the opportunity to respond." "She's trying to erase my mother's entire—" "Brittany." Diana's voice was flat. Brittany stopped. Diana looked at me from across the table. Whatever she was about to say, she thought about it for a moment first. Then, "What do you want, Marjorie?" It was the first time she had asked me that directly. No strategy, no preparation. I looked at her steadily. "What I want," I said, "cannot be given back. My husband can't return. 34 years of a marriage I believed in can't be made unambiguous. I know that." I paused. "What I am asking for, through this process, is the return of marital assets that were removed from the estate without my knowledge, and an acknowledgement, through the legal record, that those assets were marital property." "And the life insurance?" her lawyer asked. "The secondary beneficiary clause can remain with conditions agreed upon in mediation," Patricia said. "We're not here to destroy. We're here to restore what is accurate." Diana's lawyer called a short recess. During the break, I stood by the window and looked out at the Columbus skyline. Gray and ordinary, like any Midwestern city on an October morning. I thought about Ronald. I thought about the index card he had left in the bottom drawer, under the road atlas. You deserve to know. He had known at the end that this was wrong, that I deserved the truth. That had to count for something, didn't it? I didn't know what to do with it. The tenderness and the betrayal wound together like two plants growing through the same fence. When the session resumed, Diana's lawyer presented a revised position. His client was prepared to acknowledge the source of the down payment and return 60% of its equivalent value from her own assets, Now that the house had appreciated considerably, she was not prepared to contest the estate insurance conditions. Patricia looked at me. 75%, I said, and I want it in the agreement. 3 hours later, we had one. I walked out of that building in the October air and stood on the pavement for a moment, my folder under my arm, the city moving around me. I had gone in as a widow with a question. I was leaving with an answer, a settlement, and the legal record I had asked for. "You deserve to know," Ronald had written. Yes, I did. The settlement was signed 2 weeks after the mediation, in Patricia's office on Brady Street, on a gray November morning, with rain against the windows. Diana Cole agreed to pay Marjorie Hayes the sum of $38,250, 75% of the original wire transfer amount, calculated at the 2010 value, to be dispersed within 90 days. The agreement documented, in formal legal language that admitted no softening, that the funds used for the purchase of 412 West Haven Drive in June 2010 had originated from a marital asset account belonging to the estate of Ronald Hayes. That documentation was filed as part of the public record of the estate proceeding. It was not a private arrangement. It was not a handshake. It was a document with a case number, and it would remain exactly that. The life insurance clause was amended. The secondary beneficiary designation was voided, and in its place, Diana Cole received a one-time payment of $8,000 from the estate, considerably less than the original policy value, but an amount her lawyer had apparently advised her to accept. To contest it further, I was told through Patricia, would have cost more than it could possibly return. Diana had signed without further comment. Brittany had pushed back, right to the end, with the consistency I had come to expect from her. In the final exchange of documents, she had sent a message through her mother's attorney suggesting that Marjorie reconsider the insurance amendment, that it would create unnecessary hardship, and that a more compassionate resolution might be possible if both parties were willing to revisit the framework. Patricia responded in 2 sentences. The terms had been agreed upon in mediation by all parties, and any further communication outside of formal legal channels would be addressed accordingly. There was no further communication. I told Thomas first. I drove to Portland on a Sunday in late October, the week before the agreement was finalized, while the particulars were still moving through the paperwork. Thomas's wife took the girls to the park. They went cheerfully, in their small red coats, entirely unaware of the weight in the kitchen they were leaving behind. Thomas sat across from me at his own table, and I told him everything from the beginning. The envelope, the index card, the credit union account, Diana Cole, and the house in Columbus, the mediation, what was coming. He cried. I had expected that. Thomas had always felt things quickly and completely, the way certain people do, which I had loved in him since he was small. Then he was angry, and I let him be angry, and when it had moved through him, he looked at me with red eyes and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry you carried this alone for so long." I wasn't alone, I told him, not by the end. Patricia was there, Connie was there, and I was there, which turned out to be enough. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine and didn't say anything else for a while. We sat like that in his kitchen, with the rain starting outside and the girls' voices carrying faintly from somewhere down the street, and it was one of the most honest moments I can remember sharing with my son. Karen was harder. She arrived at my house in Davenport the following weekend, and I told her the same story, and she listened with the focused attention she brings to everything. Taking notes, I noticed, on her phone, which was very Karen. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 30 seconds, which I counted, and then she said, "What hasn't been done yet? What else can be pursued?" I told her that nothing else needed pursuing, that the agreement covered what needed to be covered, that the legal record existed and was permanent and was enough. She disagreed initially, in the way she disagrees with things. Not loudly, but persistently, circling back to the same point from slightly different angles. She mentioned media. She mentioned a civil claim for emotional damages. She mentioned the possibility of a public statement. I let her finish. Then I said, "Karen, I went in for the truth and the record. I got both. The goal was never to destroy anyone. The goal was to be accurate." She looked at me for a long moment. "You're more generous than they deserve," she said. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just know what I actually wanted." She accepted it eventually, through several phone calls over the following weeks, and by the time the agreement was signed, she had redirected her energy into something characteristically practical. She had quietly researched estate planning resources and sent me a very thorough email about updating my own documents, which I read and appreciated and mostly followed. There was one final matter that I had been thinking about since the summer. Connie had asked me, some weeks after the mediation, whether I had decided what to do with Ronald's desk. It was still in the study, exactly where it had always been. The oak surface where he had sat for 30 years, doing his taxes, writing his letters, building, apparently, the architecture of a second life. It was a good desk. Solid joinery, deep drawers, the kind of piece that would outlast everyone in the story. I thought about it for several days. Then I called a carpenter who had been recommended by the woodworking club Ronald had belonged to, a quiet man named Gary, who came over on a Thursday morning and looked at the desk with the respectful attention of someone who understands furniture. I explained what I wanted: the same piece, refinished. New stain, lighter, closer to honey than the dark walnut it had been. New hardware on the drawers. The surface sanded back to clean wood and treated again from the beginning. Gary did a beautiful job. When the desk came back, it looked like itself, but remade. The same structure, the same careful joints that Ronald had always admired, but the surface clean and bright in a way it hadn't been before. I moved it from the study into the living room, beneath the window that looks out onto the front yard. I put my books on it, and the photograph of the children at Christmas 3 years ago, and the small green lamp I had always liked, but which had lived, until now, in a corner of the bedroom where it wasn't fully used. It was my desk now. It had always been partly mine, in the way that everything in a marriage is partly both people's. Now, it was mine without qualification. The check from Diana Cole arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly within the 90-day window, in a plain envelope with no note inside. Just the check, made out to Marjorie E. Hayes in the agreed amount, with Diana's signature at the bottom, in the careful handwriting of someone who had thought about every letter before she wrote it. I looked at it for a moment, just looked, without hurrying to do anything with it. Then I drove to the bank and deposited it into a college savings account I had opened the previous week, in the names of my 2 granddaughters in Portland. Their grandfather had funded a house in Columbus. It seemed right, and more than right, that the returned portion of that money should fund something for the family that had always been real. Something that would grow. Something that the girls would use years from now, without any knowledge of where it had started. Which was fine. They didn't need to carry that. I had carried it, and I had put it somewhere useful, and that was enough. I kept nothing from the settlement for myself. I had what I had come for: the legal record, the documented truth, and the clear knowledge, permanent now, unambiguous, that I had not been wrong to open the envelope or to make the drive, or to sit across a conference table and ask for what was accurate. That evening, I made dinner on the good plates, the white ones with the blue border that had been a wedding gift and which I had been saving, without fully realizing it, for occasions that felt significant enough. I set one place at the table. I poured a glass of wine. I sat down in my house, in my chair, at my table, in the life that was entirely and completely mine. And I found that it felt, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, like exactly enough. The following spring was the best one I can remember in years. Thomas and his family drove down from Portland in May and spent a long weekend. We planted the back garden together, the girls on their knees in the dirt with small trowels, deeply serious about their tomatoes, which made me deeply happy. Thomas was quieter than he used to be around the house, more careful, the way people are when they've been inside a grief and come back out. We didn't talk about his father every day. Some days we talked about baseball, or the drive down, or whether heirloom tomatoes were really worth the extra effort. We talked like people who were choosing to be ordinary together, which is its own kind of love. Karen came in June with her husband. She had, as I suspected she would, processed the past year through action. She had quietly researched grief counseling resources, found a few, left the information on the kitchen counter without making it a directive. It was the kindest possible version of herself. I made an appointment. It turned out to be useful. I began going to a book group at the library, my old library, now with new chairs and a paint color on the walls I would have chosen differently, but still mine in all the ways that mattered. 6 women, meeting monthly, working their way through a list that ranged from reliable to genuinely surprising. I found that I had opinions again. That sounds small. It isn't. I took a trip in August. I had not traveled alone since before I was married. The idea of it had always been abstract. Something other people did, more adventurous people, people without obligations. But Karen had said something to me in June that stayed with me. "You've been taking care of everyone else your whole life, Mom. Where do you want to go?" I went to Savannah, Georgia. I spent 5 days walking the squares, eating shrimp and grits, sitting on the porch of a small inn in the evenings, and watching the light go long and gold over the Spanish moss. I spoke to strangers in the comfortable way you can when you're visiting a place and have no particular image to maintain. I came home with sand in my shoes and a photograph of a heron I had taken from a dock, which is now in a small frame on my desk. My desk. I still liked saying that. The following months brought their own ordinary blessings. The granddaughters on the phone on Sunday evenings, a kitchen renovation I'd been putting off for 12 years, Connie's company on Friday evenings, a Scrabble habit I'd developed with a neighbor named Ruth, who was 81 and had a vocabulary that consistently humbled me. I thought about Ronald. Less, as time passed, and differently. Not with the clench of betrayal I had felt in those early weeks. Not with the numb grief of the hospice months. More like you think about a landscape you've moved away from. It shaped you. It was real. But you are not standing in it anymore. He had been human in the fullest and most difficult sense of the word. He had failed at something essential. He had also, at the end, tried to give me the truth. I had not decided what to call that. I suspected I didn't need to. As for Diana and Brittany, I learned things secondhand, the way you learn things when the world is smaller than it seems. Diana had paid the settlement from savings she had held separately from the house. The disbursement had been manageable in the short term, but it had required her to postpone plans she'd had for the house. A renovation, I was told, by a Columbus attorney Patricia knew. She continued working in healthcare administration. She was, by most accounts, simply a woman living her life in the house she had been given, adjusting to a smaller version of the future she'd expected. Brittany had more difficulty. Her confrontational approach during the legal process had apparently extended to other areas of her life. She had been working in property management in Columbus. I was told, some months later, that she had been let go following a dispute with a client. I didn't ask for details. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Something more neutral, more like the recognition that a person who leads with threats is rarely building a stable foundation. She had, in the end, threatened me with three things: her mother's privacy, my family's pain, and public exposure. None of them had stopped me. All of them had revealed her character to everyone in that conference room who needed to see it. I had never wished her harm. I still didn't. But I noticed, with a quiet and clear-eyed satisfaction, that the world had declined to reward her for it. I found an envelope at the bottom of a drawer, and it changed everything I thought I knew. What I learned: the truth, however late, is never the wrong choice. Silence protects the wrong people. A woman who knows her own worth is very difficult to frighten. If you had been in my place, would you have opened that envelope? Would you have made that drive? I think you would. I think most of us, given the chance to finally know, will take it. If this story reached you, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more. Thank you for listening.